Welcome, everybody, to our Octane session on how to combat millions in fraud while still optimizing the digital customer experience. This is a session that, if I wasn't helping present with my good friends, I would be wanting to be sitting in the audience to watch because this is near and dear to my heart as a security practitioner. My name's Sean Frazier. I'm the federal CSO or public sector CSO at Okta. I'm joined by my great friends and partners in the solution, Lalit Ahluwalia from Accenture. He's the North American Health and Public Sector Higher Education Security Lead. My other good friend, Zachary Watkins, Director of Fraud and Identity Solutions Consulting at LexisNexis Solutions. So today we're going to be walking through a solution that was provided by Accenture, LexisNexis, and Okta for a state to deal with better customer and citizen experiences around unemployment solutions. And as you know, anytime you bring money to the internet, it's always ripe for attack and fraud. So being able to prevent fraud and deliver experiences that are even better for customers is certainly important. Lalit's going to talk about the solution that Accenture was able to build and provide for the state agency. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Okta provided capabilities in order to enable and kind of glue the solution together. And then Zach's going to take us through why identity and identity proofing is super important when it comes to kind of providing strong security and advancing good services to citizens. Lalit, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Really appreciate it. Uh, First of all, I want to really set the stage with the problem statement here because the topic suggests combating, millions of dollars in the fraudulent transactions, and I want to make sure we all understand this is not just related to the unemployment insurance. This happens, in most of the state finance systems. It happens with the pension, revenue systems, retirement systems across the board. In my role, leading our health and public service and a lot of our clients in the public sector here within Accenture, every year if you really ask me between January to April, which agency from the states that I really get the most number of calls from is usually the pension and the retirement agencies. Why? Because this is a time when a lot of the tax filing and other things happen, and there are occurrences as well as revelations of, oh my gosh, this is not my account. What happened to my payments? Where are these payments being directed? And then, like, we also have a lot of phishing attacks against the call center folks as well as the case workers. And there is always, some of the other kind of, challenges that these agencies face, and they come asking for what could be done to further solve this or resolve those issues. That being said, as Sean mentioned earlier, with the pandemic and with a lot of unemployment claims and stuff being submitted, that itself is an overwhelming task for state agencies which have not really dealt this kind of volumes in multiple years, for to say like in months or even weeks to process. And with that, as we all know, not only was the claims that were very legitimate and rightfully so from the folks, there were multi-million of those claims were coming from the bots or from the bad actors who were just trying to, claim or fraudulently claim the money, from the systems. And as we all know, public sector compared to other sectors is kind of like a little bit behind when it comes to kind of applying the latest and the greatest technologies or methods and processes. So if you really kind of like really put things in perspective, not only you're really dealing with the volume, which is the process and the operational things, but even the mechanisms to counter those things, whether monitoring, whether it's be preventing or other things, is a monumental task when you really don't have much in place on your end. So that being said, this particular case study that we're really going to talk about, and I think I'm very glad that we are presenting this in collaboration with Okta and LexisNexis, because as you all know, there's no one solution that can just go and do those things. For this kind of problem sets. And I'll probably say like this was also another a big challenge thrown at us, because when this happened, this was around the holiday period or holiday break, and there was not enough time given to kind of really go and put the plug in terms of like stopping these fraudulent transactions, but also recover the system back and bring back the sanity. So as you can see here, we're talking about almost 4 million weekly claims. And imagine how many caseworkers would we need to kind of really triage that if we really know those are the right transactions or not. And then with the states, like, where sometimes they only have thousands as their rainy day check, processing billions of dollars in unemployment, and they cannot even decline because they are rightfully citizens that are really looking for that. So it was a challenge for the agency, state agencies. So in this particular case, the state agency was dealing with this kind of volume, not even knowing, like, which ones are the right claims or like fraudulent or ones, and couple with that. This actually became a very large issue. Even at the governor level, had to testify this in front of the legislature. There was high scrutiny from the media in different ways. Of course, the citizens were not happy because some of them were not getting timely checks, and in other cases their checks were being rerouted to the fraudulent, or the imposters and others. So as you can now really see, with the claims skyrocketing, billions at stake, and then citizen experience, all those things on the challenge, the state actually came to us asking for some urgent help. And the urgent help was, can we come and really look at the systems closely and figure out what's going on in the systems, but not only just assess that and analyze it, but also come and put a solution in place that can actually, number one, tactically solve or resolve the issue. Number two, strategically put it in a place that in the long term you don't have to really face the similar challenge again. Now, I will also again emphasize, this is not just unique to unemployment insurance systems. This is a common issue that we really run into with number or variety of the finance systems or retirement systems. So the solution that you really going to see and like really, we're going to walk you through is very much applicable to all those different agencies and the departments. Now, this is where, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what the high level solution was and what the outcomes that we were able to achieve. As I mentioned earlier, this was something that we had to put in play in a matter of few weeks, not even months or years. And with the kind of support and kind of skills that you have within public sector, especially with the workforce and how slow sometimes they move, it was a monumental task, and it was very important for us to bring the right solution that can scale. And in this case, some of that was a SaaS based, means software as a service, because there was not enough time to go and deploy and configure everything from ground up. So we kind of like thought through the different solution sets. But even before we can really talk about the technology solutions, we had to really talk about what's the tactical way of resolving this issue. So first and foremost, when we're talking about the fraud, it's very important for us to can really recognize who is the person that is trying to log in and claim that particular transaction. That really goes to the heart of the whole problem, which is identity. And that was kind of is a core problem that we really run into all the time, where there's not a good handle in terms of who is trying to log in and claim the accounts. And part of this is because, as we all know, there's enough of data out in the dark web and other ways with stolen credentials, stolen identities, and stuff. So it's very easy for the bad actors to kind of impose somebody else. And if there are not enough checks in place, be able to also kind of compromise the system. And that's exactly what was happening here. So we had to actually go and tackle this at the heart of the issue, which was provide a very strong identity platform. And that's when we kind of started looking into what's the most viable solutions. And in this case, we ended up selecting Okta with LexisNexis. Okta mainly for strong authentication and multi-factor authentication, as well as LexisNexis for identity proofing and verification, and in some cases also risk adaptive authentication, because it's important to understand how the transaction is taking its course, whether that has the right parameters to even qualify for the appropriate risk, and like if the authentication needs to be bumped up to the next level. So those attributes we were able to put together with this solution set that we brought in. And also want to make sure we understand it's not just about technology pure play. It's also about looking and understanding the processes. So we also had to kind of review like how the user registration processes were working, how the user were able to get or set up an account within the system, and how they were submitting the claims. So we kind of reviewed that in conjunction with how to kind of put those, different solution sets such as MFA and identity proofing in place. With all that understanding, and as I mentioned earlier, one of the big things that we really had to resolve was we wanted something which was more, packaged as a SaaS model, because there was not enough time to really plug in. And that was like where both Okta and LexisNexis played a monumental role with us, because they came packaged with certain things, and we all had to be tuned to the needs of the system. So the success that we really were able to achieve was with those process refinements, with this technology enablers, within 3 weeks, we were able to actually stop almost 5 million fraudulent transactions or attempts that were trying to log in the system. And if you really do the maths and put the dollar amount, that actually equates to billions of dollars, which was a huge saving for a state and agency like this. So if you're really kind of interested, and we kind of also put some metrics in front of you, which is, as you can see, 4.8 million bots of failed login attempts that were prevented. You can see the deactivated accounts that were like predominantly had internet systems, close to 11,000. And then you have almost 73,000 of those accounts like that we were able to kind of, legitimately sign up for actual claims there. This was all done within 3 to 4 week period to put the state, agency on the route of success here. So that's really what's the kind of like, kind of gist of the business problem, and as I mentioned earlier, this happened during the holiday period. So, and there were like endless number of hours over the weekends and evenings and stuff, and I could not be any more proud of like how this team came together between Okta and LexisNexis, and to really put that solution and working around the clock to help the state solve this. So what you're really now seeing in front, and I'm gonna like just give a very high level flow of that, and I will let Sean to kind of like further quantify this. But as you can see here, and some of the key elements that I really mentioned were looking at the user registration workflows that were in play, how the users were getting in, refining and like really making sure that we were capturing the right attributes to establish identities and all, bringing the strong authentication and MFA solution with Okta, which we'll plug and play before we really get into there. But before even the account is established and authenticated, we have to establish and prove through identity verification. This is where the call to the LexisNexis in the flow comes in. Now, this might seem like a very tedious technical chart, and I will like let Sean kind of simplify it for all of us. But the fact is that this solution was able to put in play in 3 to 4 week period. So you're now really looking at months or years. That was the kind of beauty of the solution and the scale that we were able to provide. So with that, Sean, I'm going to hand it over to you to walk us through the solution.
Thanks, Lalit. And I'd like to highlight a few things that Lalit pointed out. There were some pretty significant illities in this architecture that was built. There was the agility in order to do it quickly, and I think Lalit pointed to the fact that working with a SaaS solution or a cloud-based solution kind of enables you to kind of support the agility and the speed at which this thing needs to be created. But I think what this slide represents is kind of flexibility around architectures. And Lalit made a good point about how this was a business system where the workflows needed to adapt to the business to deliver this great user experience or better user experience. I think probably even better than pre-pandemic, because it was all online. But being able to do that in a flexible way, so being able to bring in partners like LexisNexis and bring in other partners into the fold with regards to integration, and also enabling kind of what I would consider agile development capabilities. So being able to develop and integrate into custom legacy solutions where you might have a data source of data that needs to be accessed, and being able to kind of plug into all of those different things, and having that flexibility is certainly very, very important. And it really, as Lalit points out, it really kind of starts with identity, right? It starts when a user requests access to something. So we tend to sit at the front. We at Okta tend to sit at the front door. We have partners like LexisNexis, and we have other things that I'll talk about in the architecture in order to kind of assess the validity or the trustability of that request. But at the end of the day, we've got to support the business. So I'm a pure believer in security not as an afterthought, security as kind of DNA, but also security as a business enabler, not as business friction. And I think looking at this architecture kind of this is kind of that personified, where it talks about being able to kind of layer this into the business and very quickly deploy this entire solution within a matter of weeks, which is almost unheard of when you think of these kinds of initiatives where folks have been planning these things for months and it takes another few months to do this. You think back to a year ago, we didn't really have that kind of time. We were forced to do things much quicker, much more agile, and it turns out we can. So I think this will kind of be the new way of deploying things going forward. And I think just tying into all these different components and having that flexible architecture is really super important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of Okta and our role that we play in this architecture. And I always like to think of Okta as an identity-centric trust architecture, because we're not just about identity, we're not just about a login or an authorization or an authentication. We really are about trustability of a request. And you think back to Lalit's slide where he talked about millions of bots or millions of unwanted requests coming in trying to log in and authenticate. We want to make sure that we're bringing our capability to bear to prevent that, right? Preventing kind of the fraud at the front door where we can. So leveraging things like our own threat insight engine, leveraging the risk profiles coming from LexisNexis, and taking those things into the system and applying context to the request, right? And being able to come up with a risk score or kind of a risk assessment of the request, and in real time, kind of adjudicate this in real time as the user is requesting access, adaptive policies based on that. So that's one thing that we take very seriously as we think about this architecture. And Lalit talked about multi-factor authentication, which is an important aspect of this. And we like to think of this as kind of adaptive multi-factor authentication. So it's not just a set it and forget it. It's not just a one and done. It adapts as the threat model change. It adapts as the risk profile changes. So being able to take inputs from LexisNexis and from other providers. So we've got a large portfolio of partner providers that provide context and can provide into the engine, and then we can be the assessor and the enforcer of that allowing access or not allowing access based upon the request that's coming in and based upon the context that we see around us. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that none of this happens in a vacuum. So when you think about, this stuff happening in environments where you've got to integrate into legacy architectures, where you've got to integrate into other systems that provide security. So whether it's a SIM, whether it's some kind of other device or thing that's in your architecture, we've got to have the ability to be able to send data to that, take data from that, and make assessments and smart decisions based on that. So context is key, and it's very important. So it's not like the old days where you just had this LDAP directory sitting out there and it had some attributes in it, and you would log into it, and as long as you had the right password that was hashed in the database, you were good. There's a lot more that has to be done in order to prevent the bad guys from getting in, right? Because now we're thinking about the fact that we are the identity cloud, but we're all in the cloud. We're all connected to the same network. So as Lalit pointed out, once you bring kind of money to the environment, and once you're kind of ringing the dinner bell for attackers, because once you've kind of said, okay, we're online, we're now all connected to the internet, and people have to come in and be able to request funds or move funds, or if there's any funds available, that's just ripe for attackers to be able to come and try to take your money, because that's kind of what they do. So we have to be more adaptive. We have to be more, kind of thinking about the security architecture and building that into our process, and again, supporting the business. And this is really what Okta's what our core philosophy is all about when it comes to identity, specifically in the area of trust.
And I want to highlight that in the context of even our solution set that we're going to be walking you through, what Sean has kind of emphasized is very critical. Security is all about defense in depth and about like what layers you're trying to protect. So even the box on the right hand side, you're looking at analytics and orchestration. What really is talks about is when you're really trying to put a solution which is more preventative in nature. In this case, what we brought in with identity proofing and MFA was more preventative, right? And blocking that. But that doesn't really end, because there could be methods you can also employ to bypass even that layer. How you'd be able to then catch and like put things in play, or even say do analytics around it, or good monitoring, have a good monitoring acumen in place. That kind of helps you catch some of those scenarios as well. Now, what I would also highlight is that when we look at public sector and those kind of agencies, in this case, unemployment insurance or as I mentioned, pension systems and state finance systems. So what we also have seen is kind of like lack of certain methods and tools, technologies to really do this well-rounded security. Now, that does not take any value away from the solution that you're going to play, but I would emphasize that as you're looking into a well-rounded solution, you should also look at other layers besides identity proofing and MFA. Means not only protecting identity and like strengthen it, but what are the other security layers you want it to add to make it more effective and efficient? I think that's the key theme here to manage your security risk. So
Yeah, it's and to me these are like zero trust principles, right? It's
yeah.
you need to have active measures, you need to have passive measures. I mean, it's good to send data out to a SIM and send it out to Splunk and other things to be able to kind of look forensically at what happened, but you need the active measures. You can't look at this stuff 30 days later and say, oh, we were owned 30 days ago. You have to have the active plus the passive. So you use the word orchestration, and it is an orchestra, it's not a solo. Zach, over to you, buddy. So tell us about. I mean, I love the fact that LexisNexis and Okta kind of work hand in hand to do the proofing and do the authentication, do the risk analysis. I mean, this is exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to kind of that zero trust mindset.
Yeah, and I totally agree, Sean, and thank you for a lot of those great points that you just made on that earlier slide, because I think we both take similar approaches, that platform approach that is able to orchestrate across a number of different solutions. So we have a layered approach as well. But the benefit of working together with Okta is once we stand up the connection, we're already in place. We can, on the fly, adapt, introduce new products into a workflow, for example, to perform more accurate identity proofing. So if we take a step back and we look at, well, what are the customer needs, right? We're all living in the current pandemic, which really drove a lot of digital transformation initiatives a lot quickly than many states were, I think, expecting. And a lot of this was unprecedented. We were not necessarily prepared for the level of volume and high degree of scrutiny and fraud targeting that would occur to a number of these different systems here. So the approach that we've employed in the public sector, we were able to draw from a lot of learnings. I mean, there are similar scenarios when we look back on fintechs as it related to digital transformations of online lending. For example, retailers, going and offering e-commerce solutions out there, or ways to purchase services or goods digitally. And so this approach, having a highly scalable solution that can actually meet those volumes. Once you're a digital business, you are now cross-border. You're now a target. Once it propagates on the dark web, that it's easy to perpetrate fraud with a specific service. You need to be prepared. The full stack, the full infrastructure, as you were noting earlier, WAFs, bot detection solutions. And so we fit in quite nicely to that. So the benefit of this partnership, as I mentioned earlier with Okta and Accenture, is once you've essentially coded to our solution, either via an inline hook from Okta, custom workflows, custom apps, we can really take it from there and adapt scalable risk-based approaches. And so if we move over to that next slide here, you'll see, well, what's the focus from a LexisNexis standpoint in terms of that layered approach? So we need to have a way to match that authentication experience to the risk of the transaction, right? It's a delicate balance. If we introduce too much friction into that check from an identity proofing standpoint, we're going to inundate that call center. That's already inundated, especially in this scenario that we're describing here. So a lot of what we need to do has to be passive. Okta has a great solution at looking at device connection. We have a very complementary solution in that as well, because LexisNexis has made some strategic acquisitions of like ThreatMetrix, if you're familiar with that solution, or Emailage, if you're familiar with that solution, which is consortium based. So as Sean mentioned earlier, context is key. It's one thing to know that we have a device, we can look at the integrity of the device, and make a decision that way. It's another to know, well, how is this device associated to this location and the actual PII prior to this transaction? This is where we move to prevention, right? The ability to pull in context on, is this in fact Zach using Zach's information, or is it Sean using Zach's information? Before we even do a verification on that PII to know, is Zach actually residing at that address, right? So it's really critical that we take that passive approach first, minimize the friction, And then we get surgical on when we're going to introduce certain elements of MFA. And not all MFA is the same, right? It can be simple OTP. It can be knowledge-based questions. It can be as friction-filled as asking that citizen to scan a document, assess the validity of the document, pull the PII, and validate the PII that way. So we need to apply those different methods a bit more strategically. So I think the takeaway from this is one size fits all approach isn't satisfactory anymore, right? Just doing an identity verification check is not enough. It's critical, but it's not enough. We need to tie the context around that PII, and we need to apply that appropriate amount of friction where it's necessary here.
I was just going to add to that. I think you're exactly right. And I think this is the one thing that most security practitioners always forget about is that, we want to be able to provide strong security, but we want to be able to reduce that friction. And, if I'm the same person coming from the same device, from the same location all the time, and I look the same, why do I need to jump through 30 hoops to get access to my data? Whereas if I'm looking a little different, there's a risk profile that exists, then I think I'm okay with a little bit of friction if you're doing that friction in order to protect me.
And I would probably say, like, from our experience working with public sector entities specifically, it goes even more than or broader than just like, okay, organization-based experience, because a lot of this are end users, mean citizens, and you are in the service, or you are the service provider to the citizens, and you need to make it as friendly as possible, or you're not going to have a user adoption. And a lot of the system rollouts do fail because of the lack of user adoption. So there is definitely a fine balance between the user experience as well as the enhanced security posture. And I think Zach's points are pretty much spot on. I can tell you, your workflows and solutions needs to be flexible and nimble enough to adapt to that. Of course, you need to balance the risk, and I think this is where it really came down to. But it needs to be very user friendly.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Lalit, because we all are consumers, so we all have an expectation when we interact with a digital service. And from a friction standpoint. And so the moment frustration emerges, we're going to take the path of least resistance. We're going to call in, we're going to inundate an already inundated call center in a lot of these cases.
Yeah, and there's a lot, and that's a great point, because there's a lot to learn from how we live in our personal lives, which I think that our personal lives have kind of leapfrogged our business lives with regards to kind of usability and meshing security. So I always think about kind of the Apple model of Touch ID, Face ID. If I can log into my bank using Face ID, and it's a seamless biometric, why can't I leverage that in my business life?
Yeah, now if we dive a little bit deeper into that layered approach, right? So the approach that LexisNexis employs really relies on, and if we move to the next slide here, really relies on our core data assets. And so we have many public proprietary data assets that's fueling a lot of the core LexisNexis solutions. And as I mentioned earlier, recent acquisitions have taken on this, more digital context from this consortium view, the threat metrics, the email edges of the world. And so if we kind of work our way through that stack, it looks fairly similar. Some of the top level, definitions of each of these layers here looks very similar to that context slide that Sean was showing earlier. And this is because we employ a very similar approach in terms of starting broad, casting that wide net. First, looking at passively the connection, looking at where on the globe is this actor at this point in time? Are they a human or not? Tying in the associations through a consortium view, and being able to tell, okay, has there actually been an association to this PII from this device and location before? And that's where, if you're familiar with solutions like threat metrics, those are key, because we can pull in real-time context from daily interactions with sites, brands, services that also use that same solution. So, you think about that's currently deployed on 50,000 different websites today. Many of us as consumers interact with different sites and services all throughout the day. And so now this particular state and this particular Department of Labor is able to pull in that context in real time. So if this email, for example, was just seen on the other side of the globe 5 minutes ago, that's critical context, right? So that first layer is tremendous. Think of that as kind of the Ring doorbell, if you will. Just assessing right out the door, should we have allowed them to proceed onward? That next layer down below would then start to derive from the physical identity information, the core Lexis properties, on, is this legitimate PII? Does this person reside at this address? Based on their footprint from a physical view of things that we have, are they who they say they are? And there's a lot more that goes into that around risk indicators, synthetic identity information, stolen information. Where else have we seen that information, and any risk flags associated to that? What we then would do, this is a critical inflection point now, this is where we then would move to the consumer facing or citizen facing aspect, the actual authentication piece. And Okta has a tremendous breadth of native solutions in this space, right? We can drive the Okta built-in MFA, for example. We also have solutions in this space as well. Certain things like if we do need to assess the documentation of an individual, the liveness check, if you will, right? Taking a picture of your driver's license, taking a selfie, seeing if they match, also assessing the liveness of the individual who is taking that selfie as well. So the benefit of this layered approach, as I mentioned earlier, is we can build those custom workflows. We can waterfall through all of these. And in many cases, this may be only through one API call that Okta is making externally to our service. And then we can, on the fly, modify the logic, tighten those different waterfall capabilities into other products, introduce entirely new solutions based on the actual risk that we're seeing or the fraud vector that we're seeing there. And lastly, the final layer, we have platforms that are fueling this as well. They can also be state facing. If they want to self-manage this, make changes on the fly, that is totally possible. They can rely on our expertise, of course, our partnerships here to do that on their behalf. But the capabilities are there. We are a very clear box. This ties in seamlessly into the analytics engines, the event managers, the SIMs of the world, if you would also like to take this data and feed it into other downstream systems.
Yeah. So Zach, first of all, thank you for walking this through, multifaceted approach and the layers of defense. Let me also maybe simplify something for the audience here. When we looked at, and this business problem, with an Accenture we were looking at, we did discuss this, all these 4 layers, but not in technology definition. The way we kind of approach it was we kind of like, narrated, let's talk about what kind of your problem you're facing and what can you do at each point to do that. For example, the first line of defense. When we talked about, okay, you have this millions of accounts getting created, have you verified who these accounts are, where they're coming from, in what context are they coming from? And that really kind of led us to kind of discovery with identity verification, which, honestly, this is something, a concept that we've been now talking for decades or more, but still adoption has been very slow, because for whatever reason. I think part of this is because it becomes a little more cumbersome, or people rely on manual processes to do the verification, and they kind of really forget, because everything going digital, is important to have digital verifications of those accounts. Now, the second line of defense we're talking about was to really understand now if this user is coming and establishing itself, are we able to kind of link it to their proper account and what they should be getting? And in this cases, sometimes you are interacting with other systems outside of this core system. So the correlation of identity is important. So we kind of have to triage that too. Are there certain attributes that make us kind of okay, this is the person or identity that is trying to get access to his own account? The third line of defense is really coming to the strong authentication aspect, right? Multi-factor authentication, where whether it's OTP, whether it's kind of biometrics, of course, we kind of resorted to the out-of-band processes with OTP, like email-based and SMS-based. Down the line, we can look into biometrics and stuff. So one thing I want to emphasize, even though you see kind of multiple ways you can tackle these layers of defense, our solution has certain elements in each of the layers, all the 4 layers. But when we kind of really narrated the story, was not in technology landscape. This was something how the business problem needs to be narrated. And then we brought in these components of technology solutions. Okay, Okta can provide this, LexisNexis will provide this, process refinement provides this. And if I were to kind of take anything from this session, is to really be able to tell the story in the business sense. That's where your buyers will truly understand what they're trying to really get into and why that is important. So let's not really get overwhelmed, whoa, there are so many elements in each layer, do I have to do all that? No, that's not as important. There are certain elements in each layer that you have to do, but they logically will fit when you kind of start dissecting your business problem.
Yeah, and that's where the partnership between Accenture and Okta and LexisNexis is key, because we've essentially streamlined the integration component. We were able to modify and customize a specific workflow across all of these different layers to seamlessly integrate, the identity proofing component for this particular instance.
Yeah.
And I think even taking a step back, right, on this next slide, to really simplify it down, the layered approach really tackles three key areas. And this is all based on, our technology partnerships and serving up this connection, but also in terms of like the consultative approach that we have here on what makes sense based on the specific use case. So those three areas, as you can see here on the top, right, there's the fraud risk decisioning component. We call that also identity assurance, right? That when we're building a workflow, that consortium type of view on that connection, that ring doorbell. Are they who they say they are? Is it a bot? Is it a human? We also then have the verification component, verifying the actual PII for the identity verification component, and then the authentication piece. There can be, native with Okta, certain solutions that LexisNexis provides. But in this particular case, Accenture designed an excellent workflow that touched on each of these key areas. We ultimately built that connection and the logic to deliver for that specific use case here.
Yeah. And again, I do want to emphasize this was a true partnership in display, because our client really truly appreciated how this multiple parties, that we brought to the table seamlessly integrated to really provide that value proposition and the desired outcomes. And they were like, they did not really see like three different vendors coming to make a play. It was kind of like a very seamless integration to them. It was somebody working in their own interest, solving their business problem.
Yeah, and that's a great point. One thing that I do have to give tremendous credit to all of our teams is, you mentioned it earlier, Lalit. I mean, this was weeks, not months, and that's the full from being engaged to being deployed live. And
Yeah.
so the ability to turn this around quickly, speaks volumes to our partnership from a technology standpoint, right? Being able to establish the connectivity between our different solutions, but to tackle that specific a pain point and deliver immediate results.
Yeah.
And I like to think of things in kind of bigger context also. I think that, think back a year ago, this was done out of necessity. We had to do this. Everyone's working from home. Everyone's, dealing with the pandemic and lockdown. But to me, this is the future, right? I think about larger society where, people who entered the workforce like 5 years ago never lived on a planet without the internet. So when they are in the workforce and they need things like unemployment benefits, or they need something, in the future accessing retirement benefits, this is the way they will want to work. So we're building this thing, when we call this future proofing, this is really kind of future forward. We got forced to do it very quickly, but this helps us in the future. So I want to thank Lalit and Zach for joining me today. This has been a fantastic conversation, and this is one of those home run solutions that you don't get to talk about very often. And as I mentioned, this is something I would love to just sit in the audience and absorb, let alone be lucky enough to participate in. If you want to reach out to any of us, here are our contact information. Any of us are happy to talk about the solution, talk about the capabilities, and how we're doing this across the board in a lot of different environments. And I would like to really, really thank Lalit and Zach for being great partners in this solution and for joining me today.
Absolutely. I hope like the audience finds it helpful. I think my key takeaway is this is a real life problem and not just specific to one agency or one kind of kind of system. So this solution, and of course like some technology layers can always be kind of switched with whatever. So let's not really get, oh, this is the only thing. As Zach also mentioned, that there's no one size fits all. But the business problem is very relevant, and I think the proactive action that we can take in this respect will only gonna make our public service, partners even better and more efficient.
Indeed. Thanks, gentlemen.
Awesome. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.